The morning of July 13, 1940, was clear over the Bavarian Alps, and the view from Hitler's Berghof residence was almost obscenely beautiful. The mountains rose in the south, bright with early summer, and somewhere far to the north, across a flat and occupied Europe, lay the English Channel. Beyond it, Britain, stubborn, defiant, and by every rational calculation of power, completely finished. General Franz Halder arrived at the Berghof that morning carrying maps and figures. He was 56 years old, precise in manner, bespectacled, a Bavarian Catholic who kept a meticulous diary and privately considered many of the men he served under to be ideological criminals. He was also the chief of the German Army General Staff, one of the most professionally accomplished soldiers in the world, and the man Hitler had summoned to present the operational plans for the final act of the war in the West. France had fallen 3 weeks earlier. The armistice had been signed in the same railway carriage in the Campine forest where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had insisted on it, a precise historical reversal of the humiliation. Poland was gone. Norway was occupied. Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, all gone. The German army stood on the Atlantic coast from the Spanish border to the North Cape of Norway. No continental power remained. Britain, perched on its island, was surrounded. Halder spread his maps on the table. The invasion plan he was presenting was called Operation Sea Lion. It called for 9 German divisions, roughly 67,000 men in the first wave, to cross the English Channel in a fleet of converted river barges and land on the beaches of Sussex and Kent, between Rottingdean in the west and Hythe in the east. A parachute division would drop to support the flanks. Once ashore, the Wehrmacht would advance on London in a pincer movement. After London fell, German forces would push north to roughly the 52nd parallel, a line running through the English Midlands. At that point, Hitler believed Britain would surrender. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hitler listened to Halder's briefing that July morning with an unusual quality of inattention. He asked no questions about specific operations. He made no recommendations to improve the plans. He simply told the Wehrmacht leadership to begin preparations. Those who had served with Hitler long enough to read his moods understood what this meant. He did not expect to actually need it. In the summer of 1940, the assumption running through every level of German command, from the Führer's headquarters down to the regimental officers watching the Channel from the French cliffs, was that this was already over. The Wehrmacht had shattered France in 6 weeks. A country the Kaiser's armies had bled against for 4 years without breaking. It had done so with a speed and a tactical brilliance that shocked even the Germans themselves. Franz Halder, who before the offensive had written in his diary that if they reached Boulogne after 6 months of heavy fighting they would be lucky, had watched the campaign unfold with a kind of professional astonishment. They had reached Boulogne in 6 weeks. The mood in Berlin was intoxicating. Newspapers called Hitler the greatest general in history. Soldiers who had survived the Western campaign wore their victories lightly, with the easy confidence of men who have done something difficult and found it, in the end, not so difficult after all. Britain would come to terms. It would have to. Churchill was simply being stubborn, playing for time, hoping for something, American intervention, Soviet pressure, a German miscalculation that would never come. Give him a few more weeks, and he would accept the reality that every other European government had already accepted. The war was over. Germany had won. This was the world in which Franz Halder was now planning the occupation of Great Britain. The occupation plan was thorough, because Halder was a thorough man and thoroughness was the professional reflex of the German General Staff, which had been training officers in systematic campaign planning for 3 generations. Even if Sea Lion itself was unlikely to be necessary, the occupation machinery had to be ready. The SS was already preparing for it. Walter Schellenberg, a young SS intelligence officer, had been ordered at the end of June 1940 to prepare a handbook for the political and administrative units that would accompany the invasion forces. He described briefly the most important political, administrative, and economic institutions of Great Britain and the leading public figures. The result was a document that would not be discovered by the outside world until 1945, when Allied troops found it in the rubble of a Berlin headquarters building. It was called the Sonderfahndungsliste GB, the Special Search List for Great Britain. Its cover was stamped with a single word, Geheim, secret. Inside were 2,820 names, printed in alphabetical order. Beside each name was a designation indicating which branch of the Reich Security Main Office would take custody of the individual upon arrest. Most were assigned to AMT4, the Gestapo. A selected few were assigned to AMT6, the Foreign Intelligence Service. Winston Churchill was assigned to AMT6. He was to be detained, not executed, at least not immediately. He was considered too significant to simply disappear. The list read like a directory of everything that had made Britain what it was. Winston Churchill, Neville Chamberlain, Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher and the novelist alongside the politician, all to be swept up in the first days of occupation and handed to their designated bureau for processing. Noel Coward was on the list. So was Charles de Gaulle, listed as former French general. Already in London and already a problem that the Reich intended to solve permanently. Even Sigmund Freud appeared, listed posthumously. Schellenberg's team had apparently not checked whether their targets were still alive. Freud had died in London in September 1939, but his name remained on the warrant. The apparatus of occupation had been built before anyone confirmed its targets still existed to be occupied. Accompanying the arrest list was a handbook for occupation administrators. It covered British geography, economics, the political system, the legal system, the educational structure, the press and radio, religious institutions, trade unions, and something that concerned the SS with particular intensity, the Freemasons. Public schools were flagged. Oxford and Cambridge were specifically noted as centers of anti-Nazi sentiment, and their faculty were marked for special attention. The Boy Scouts were listed as a dangerous organization. The Church of England was described as, in Hitler's own words, nothing but a tool of empire power politics. The handbook noted, with a precision that would have been darkly comic if it weren't so serious, that Eton College was sold out until 1949, and suggested that SS officers not attempt to enroll their children. It surveyed British museums and art galleries for their contents, noting opportunities for what it described with bureaucratic neutrality as acquisition. The Elgin marbles, already a matter of dispute, would have found themselves with a new and less negotiable claimant. Franz Halder did not write the arrest list. That was an SS matter, and the relationship between the Wehrmacht Professional Officer Corps and the SS was always one of mutual contempt barely restrained by shared institutional necessity. But Halder was writing the plan that would have made the arrest list operational. He was designing the military framework inside which the occupation administrators would function. Every route of advance, every supply depot, every communication line his staff sketched on their maps of southern England was, in an indirect but complete way, the infrastructure that would carry SS Einsatzgruppen to their targets. This was the particular horror of what Halder was doing in the summer of 1940, and what makes his story so much more than a military planning exercise. He was a professional soldier in the old Prussian tradition, a man who believed, privately and genuinely, that what the Nazis were doing to Europe was barbaric and that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. He had participated in a tentative conspiracy against Hitler in 1938, during the Czech crisis, that had evaporated when the British and French capitulated at Munich and removed the political basis for any coup. He had watched the war unfold with the mixed emotions of a man who despised the regime he served and could not deny the military achievements it kept producing. And now he was planning the conquest of the last free major democracy in Europe, the completion of a victory that would have made everything that followed, every arrest, every camp, every systematic atrocity, not just possible but inevitable. He did his job. He was very good at it. The plan, as Halder's staff developed it through July and early August, was built around Army Group A under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. This was the same formation that had driven through the Ardennes to cut off the French and British armies at Dunkirk, the most successful operational maneuver of the campaign in the West. Von Rundstedt's command would cross from Le Havre and the Pas-de-Calais area, landing in two armies. The 16th Army under General Ernst Busch would land in the east, between Ramsgate and Bexhill. The 9th Army under General Adolf Strauss would land further west, near Brighton. Together they would establish a front from the Thames estuary to Portsmouth, pause to consolidate, then execute a double envelopment of London. The Army's plan called for 13 divisions in the first wave, then follow-on forces building to 39 divisions total, roughly 500,000 men. They would advance northward after taking London, reaching a line from Malden in Essex to the Severn estuary, roughly encompassing the southern third of England. Hitler's assumption, stated explicitly at planning conferences, was that Britain would surrender before German forces reached this line. He had watched France, Poland, the Low Countries, and Norway all capitulate when their capitals or strategic heartlands were threatened or taken. He saw no reason why Britain should be different. There was, however, a problem. There were actually several problems, and they were the kind of problems that only became fully visible when you sat down with the people who were actually supposed to make the plan work. The problem that Halder encountered first was the navies. Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had been warning since the early planning stages that Germany did not possess the naval capacity to protect an invasion fleet across the English Channel. The Battle of Norway had cost the Kriegsmarine dearly. By the summer of 1940, the surface fleet available to protect Sea Lion consisted of 1 heavy cruiser, the Hipper, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. That was it. The Royal Navy, by comparison, had at least 7 capital ships, 15 cruisers, and more than 30 destroyers immediately available in home waters. Even before considering the RAF, the mathematics of naval power were catastrophic for Germany. Raeder's preferred invasion front ran from Dover to Eastbourne, the absolute minimum width he believed the Kriegsmarine could protect from British surface forces. Halder rejected this with an explosion of professional exasperation. From the Army's point of view, he said at a planning conference, a landing on that narrow a front was complete suicide. He might just as well put the troops that had landed straight through a sausage machine. The debate between the Army and the Navy over the width of the invasion front was, in retrospect, an argument about which kind of catastrophe to prefer. The Army wanted a front wide enough to prevent German forces from being surrounded and destroyed on the beaches. The Navy wanted a front narrow enough that its minimal fleet had some chance of holding the flanks. Neither option was genuinely safe because the fundamental precondition for safety, naval superiority in the English Channel, was simply unavailable. The invasion fleet Halder's planners were assembling to compensate for this inadequacy was itself a source of private horror to any professional naval officer who looked at it carefully. Germany possessed no purpose-built landing craft. The vessels that would carry the Wehrmacht across 22 miles of tidal channel, one of the most difficult stretches of water in the world, were approximately 2,400 inland river barges, most of them built for navigating the calm, predictable Rhine and Danube. They had flat bottoms, minimal draft, and almost no seakeeping ability in open water. The majority were unpowered and had to be towed by tugs. Many were open to the weather. They moved at walking pace, roughly 4 miles per hour in ideal conditions. The channel in September is not ideal. Autumn in the North Sea and English Channel brings frequent storms, shifting winds, and swells that a river barge with a flat bottom and German infantrymen crowded below deck could not survive. The planning staffs knew this. The meteorological studies commissioned for Sea Lion showed that the window of acceptable weather in the Channel in autumn was narrow, and narrowing. Every week of delay was a week of deteriorating conditions. Halder's diary from this period is a document of professional desperation dressed in the language of objective analysis. On the 28th of July, after reviewing the Navy's situation, he wrote that if what Raeder had told him was true, all previous statements by the Navy were so much rubbish and they could throw away the whole plan of invasion. He did not throw it away. He kept planning because that was what the situation demanded and because there was still, in the military atmosphere of that summer, a genuine belief that these problems were solvable. The Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force. Without air cover, the Royal Navy could not operate in the Channel in daylight. Without daylight operations, the British surface fleet could not intercept the invasion barges. The barges would cross. The Army would land. Britain would fall. It was a chain of reasoning, and each link in the chain had to hold for the conclusion to follow. The first link, Luftwaffe supremacy, was Hermann Göring's responsibility, and Göring had guaranteed it personally in the confident booming way he guaranteed everything. The Luftwaffe would destroy the RAF in 2 weeks to 4 weeks. It had the aircraft. It had the pilots. It had experience from Spain, Poland, Norway, France. The RAF, by comparison, was a depleted second-rank air force that had taken heavy losses supporting the army in France and would not survive sustained pressure. Göring believed this. His operations staff believed it. The intelligence summaries they distributed confidently placed RAF fighter command strength far below actual levels and projected a collapse of British air resistance within days of a sustained offensive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What the German intelligence staff did not know, what the fractured, rivalry-riddled German intelligence apparatus was structurally incapable of discovering, was that Britain had built something entirely new in the defense of its airspace. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had constructed what historians would later call the Dowding System, an integrated network of radar stations along the coast feeding information in near real time to sector control stations, which directed fighter squadrons to intercept points with a precision and economy of effort that no previous air defense system had approached. German pilots crossing the Channel expected to find scrambled British fighters hunting for them randomly in a vast sky. Instead, they found Spitfires and Hurricanes already positioned at altitude, already on course, already climbing toward the precise coordinates where the radar network had tracked the German formations. The campaign that began in earnest on the 13th of August 1940, Adlertag Eagle Day, was not what Göring had promised. The Luftwaffe flew 1,485 sorties that day and lost 45 aircraft. The RAF lost 13 fighters. In the following days, the losses continued at rates that German planning had never anticipated. The fundamental asymmetry of the situation worked against Germany in ways that multiplied over time. German pilots shot down over Britain were out of the war, prisoners if they survived, dead if they did not. British pilots shot down over Britain walked back to their airfields, sometimes the same day, and flew again. Every Spitfire pilot who survived a bailout over Sussex was an asset that Germany could not destroy. Every Messerschmitt pilot who parachuted into Kent was an asset Germany could not recover. The German aircraft industry, meanwhile, was not producing replacements at the rate the offensive demanded. Monthly Luftwaffe fighter production in the summer of 1940 stood at roughly 300 airframes. Britain, under the ferocious management of Lord Beaverbrook at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, was producing more. British fighter production in 1940 would reach over 4,200 aircraft for the full year, a rate that meant the RAF could absorb losses that would have been terminal for any normally structured air force. By September 7th, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to just 533 operational fighters. British Fighter Command actually had more pilots available than it had in July. On September 7th, Hitler made the decision that aviation historians have argued over ever since. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its primary attacks from RAF airfields to London. The Blitz, the systematic bombing of British cities, had begun. The operational reason was political. German bombers had accidentally struck residential London on the night of August 24th. Churchill had ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin, and Hitler, furious and personally humiliated, had demanded that London burn in response. But the operational consequence was that the Luftwaffe took the pressure off Fighter Command at the precise moment when Fighter Command was most strained. RAF losses fell below the rate of replacement. The shortage of trained pilots, acute through August, began to ease. The airfields that had been battered and barely functional through the worst weeks of the battle were given time to repair. Franz Halder watched all of this from his headquarters with a professional anguish that his diary only partially conceals. He had known from the beginning that the success of Sea Lion depended on air superiority, and he had watched with growing dread as the Luftwaffe offensive consumed itself against a defense that refused to break. On September 17, Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. There was no new date. There was no revised plan. There was simply an acknowledgement, dressed in the bureaucratic language of military directives, that the preconditions for invasion had not been met and that preparations were to be maintained for diplomatic and political pressure, but that no cross-channel operation was anticipated in the near future. In October, Hitler issued a new directive formally releasing the forces earmarked for Sea Lion to other fronts. The barges that had been assembled in the Channel ports, 2,400 rivercraft that had disrupted German inland commerce for months and presented RAF bomber command with extraordinary targets, were dispersed. The troops who had been training for amphibious assault in England were sent instead to the Balkans. By December, the planning was already underway for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The papers on which the administrative occupation of Great Britain had been so carefully detailed were filed away, classified, and forgotten. Halder knew, with the clarity that comes from having built something in complete professional detail and then watched it become impossible, exactly what had been lost and exactly why. The army had been ready. The army was always ready. That was, in the Prussian tradition, what armies were for. But the army could not cross 22 miles of hostile channel in river barges against the Royal Navy without air superiority, and air superiority had not been achieved, could not be achieved, because the British had built a defense for which the Luftwaffe had no effective answer. What Halder could not write in his diary, what he could barely form into coherent private thought, was the larger realization that the summer of 1940 had forced upon him. The war that Hitler was fighting was not the kind of war that the Wehrmacht's brilliance at operational maneuver could win. The campaign in France had been a masterpiece, but France was a land power on a continent, and the German army was a land power on a continent, and the terrain between them permitted the kind of fast-moving armored warfare that the Wehrmacht had perfected. Britain was something different. Britain was an island with a navy and an air force and a political culture that had decided, under Churchill's leadership, that survival was worth any cost. That combination, geography, naval power, air power, political will, created a problem that armored columns could not solve because armored columns could not reach it. And beyond Britain lay something that Halder was beginning, in the summer of 1940, to understand with the precision of a man who deals in figures and plans. Beyond Britain lay the United States. Not yet in the war, not yet committed to a British alliance, but producing ships and aircraft and tanks at rates that Germany could not match even in peacetime, let alone under the pressure of a war economy. If Britain held out long enough for America to enter, and the mathematics of British industrial survival suggested it could hold out for years, then Germany faced a combination of opponents whose combined productive capacity would dwarf anything the Reich could generate, no matter how brilliantly its armies maneuvered. Halder had made a note in his diary in the spring of 1940, before the campaign in France had even finished. Germany, he wrote, was seeking contact with Britain on the basis of a global division of influence. This was the war's end he had privately hoped for. Germany dominant in continental Europe, Britain maintaining its empire, America staying out, and a negotiated peace that preserved the European order without the catastrophe of a second total war. That hope had died on the beaches of Normandy, not D-Day but Dunkirk, where Churchill had decided that no negotiated peace with Hitler was possible and that Britain would fight on regardless of what the continent looked like. The occupation plan that Halder had so carefully drafted through July and August of 1940 was never implemented. The 2,820 names on the special search list were never arrested. Virginia Woolf was never taken to Gestapo headquarters. H.G. Wells was never handed to whatever bureau had been assigned the literary intellectuals of the British Empire. Churchill was never delivered to the custody of AMT-6. Winston Churchill, who had refused every peace overture, who had mobilized the language of a civilization to resist what he called the New Dark Ages, who had stood in the House of Commons and offered his country nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, was never made to answer for his defiance. SS Brigadefuhrer Dr. Franz Six had been designated, on September 17, 1940, to a position in London where he would implement the post-invasion arrests and actions against institutions. September 17th was the same day Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Six went instead to the Soviet Union, where he commanded an Einsatzgruppe and oversaw the murder of thousands of Soviet civilians in the early months of Barbarossa. He was convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. He was released in 1952. Franz Halder continued as chief of the German Army General Staff through the invasion of the Soviet Union, the advance to Moscow, the catastrophe of the winter of 1941-42, and the first year of the grinding Eastern War. He clashed repeatedly with Hitler over operational decisions and was dismissed in September 1942. Hitler told him that his nerves had worn out. In fact, Halder had continued to believe, with increasing urgency and decreasing ability to conceal it, that Germany was losing a war it could not win, and that the man making the decisions was a military amateur with an aesthetic of violence substituting for a grasp of strategy. After his dismissal, Halder was watched by the Gestapo. After the July 20, 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, a conspiracy Halder had known of and not reported, he was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp. He survived the war in SS custody, was liberated by American forces in May 1945, and subsequently worked for the United States Army Historical Division, writing detailed accounts of German military operations that American analysts used to study the Wehrmacht's doctrine and methods. He lived until 1972. He was 87 years old when he died in a show in Chiemgau, a small Bavarian town not far from the mountains he had looked at on the morning of July 13, 1940, when he had spread his maps on a table at the Berghof and briefed a plan for the occupation of a country that was never going to fall. The Sonderfahndungsliste, the Black Book, was found in Berlin in September 1945. When its contents were published, the reactions of those listed ranged from amusement to outrage. Noel Coward, who had used his celebrity throughout the war to entertain troops and gather intelligence in a manner that actually had brought him to German attention, reportedly said that he was enormously flattered to be included in such distinguished company. Rebecca West, the writer and journalist, surveyed the list and concluded that it was gratifying to find oneself considered dangerous by such a regime. The historian A.J.P. Taylor, who was not on the list, noted that its omissions were as instructive as its inclusions. George Bernard Shaw, perhaps the most famous living British writer in 1940, did not appear, possibly because his socialist and anti-imperialist positions had sometimes found sympathetic audiences in Germany, and the compilers were uncertain how to categorize him. The errors were numerous. People long dead, people who had emigrated years before, people whose offense against the Reich was nothing more than having written a mildly critical article about fascism in a journal that had found its way into SS files. The occupation of Britain existed as a complete administrative structure. The lists, the handbooks, the designated headquarters, the assigned officials, the cultural program for looting museums, in the summer of 1940, for exactly the brief window when a German victory seemed not merely possible but inevitable. And then the RAF held. Not decisively, not cleanly. The battle was exhausting and costly, and there were moments when the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain to the men fighting it. But the RAF held enough. Fighter Command remained operational when Sea Lion would have needed to cross. The Royal Navy remained capable. The Channel remained contested. The river barges remained on the rivers. The occupation plan remained in the files. What Franz Halder had built in those summer months of 1940 was a window into the world that did not come to be, a detailed, operational, bureaucratically complete vision of what German victory in the West would have looked like in its immediate aftermath. The arrest lists, the designated Gestapo offices, the looting schedules for British museums, the plans for dismantling the Church of England and the Boy Scouts and the public school system, these documents survive as a kind of negative photograph, an image of a darkness that existed in full administrative preparation and was prevented from developing into reality by a few hundred pilots, by radar stations along the English coast, by Lord Beaverbrook's factory workers, and by a prime minister, who had decided, before the summer began, that surrender was simply not available as an option. The question that gives this story its title, What If Germany Had Won, was not, for the men who lived through the summer of 1940, an abstract historical speculation. For Franz Halder, working through those July and August nights on the maps and orders and supply calculations for a Britain under German occupation, it was the operational plan on his desk. For the 2,820 people on the special search list, it was a personal threat that never materialized. For Hitler, who had hoped all summer that Churchill would simply come to his senses and accept the reality that everyone else had accepted, it was a disappointment that he never quite recovered from. Because Britain's refusal to fall meant that the war had to go on, east into the Soviet Union, west into the Atlantic, and eventually to a confrontation with American power that Germany had no realistic hope of surviving. Halder understood all of this by September of 1940, though he could not say so, could not write it plainly even in the diary he kept in a private shorthand system to protect it from discovery. He had planned the victory, built the machinery for it, and watched it remain in the files while the war moved on to the decisions that would ultimately destroy everything he had served and much of what he had loved. He was a man who had seen the future clearly enough to draw its maps, and then had to watch the future refuse to arrive. The Black Book sits today in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London and at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. 2 copies survived, both stamped Geheim, both numbered, both carrying the instruction that all persons listed were to be arrested. The instruction was never carried out. The persons listed mostly lived their lives, wrote their books, made their films, gave their speeches, survived the war, and died in their own time in a country that remained, against all reasonable probability in the summer of 1940, free. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.